Hi everyone, and welcome to the Paradigm Shifters Book Club. This is part 6 of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa, Marya and Patel. And this is the concluding part, and I'm going to call this episode De-Inflaming, the big picture. So, what do we know so far, based on the last 5 videos? Let me do a 10-second wrap-up of the first 5 episodes. Under the new inflammation model of medicine, we know that chronic inflammatory disease is our biggest killer and our biggest category of illness and disability. We know that this includes cancers, heart disease, strokes, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, lung diseases, psychiatric illnesses, and more. We know that a huge proportion of these diseases are preventable so that we can stop them before they begin. We know that the causes are environmental, to do with diet, environmental toxicity, but also our psychological environment matters. Relationships matter. Stress and trauma inflame the body. We know that there are many things that we can do for ourselves and for our families to reduce, and better still, to prevent chronic inflammation. We have plenty of agency. These diseases are not entirely inescapable. But there's also a bigger picture. We also know that there are plenty of policy changes at the national level that would dramatically reduce, and in some cases eliminate altogether, an A to Z of chronic inflammatory disease. And here's one more thing that we know. We know that if we join forces to reduce the toxic things that are inflaming humanity, our natural immune response to a new viral disease would be quite a bit better than what we've had during past pandemics. So, in my mind, it makes more sense to start acting well in advance rather than to wait helplessly until the next big virus comes our way. Preventive policy should be the imperative. And given what we know now, it would be delinquency not to act. So that's what I want to talk to you about in this video. What we can all do, what we should all do to stop the tidal wave of inflammatory disease. But before I go on, I want to keep this realistic. Even if we know the root cause of systemic inflammation, this doesn't mean that we can be invincible. It doesn't mean that we'll be guaranteed to never get sick, and it won't mean that post hoc or after the fact medical interventions will be obsolete. Far from it. But it does mean that you can take a significant amount of personal responsibility for yours and your family's health, probably quite a bit more than you realized. Up to the limit, of course, of what your life circumstances permit. And here's a new thought to ponder. It also means that we can take some agency for the health of other people too. In other words, our community, our nation, our world. And here are some notable examples. We can save millions of lives and immeasurable levels of suffering by pushing hard for energy transition to clean renewables. Get rid of all of that particulate matter in the air that's killing millions and sickening millions more. We can save millions of lives by agitating for a tax on sugar and on overly processed foods. And we can save millions more lives by demanding a faster transition to regenerative and organic agriculture. Do you see a pattern here? Most of what needs to be done to save all of these lives and prevent all of this suffering involves government regulations and government incentives for corporations to change what they do. When the fallout from big business activities is causing wholesale inflammation, we have to enforce a change in the ways of business for the public good. And here are some more revelations. The deeper we go into the implications of the inflammation model of medicine, inflammation model of medicine, the more questions are answered. For example, if you've ever wondered why sometimes diet and exercise don't seem to be enough to reduce inflammation-related conditions, including unwanted weight gain and so on, well, now you might know why something else might be inflaming you, or at least contributing in part to your chronically inflamed state. You might have had exposure to other toxic chemicals through food, water, clothes, soil, your home environment, or perhaps a toxic workplace, or even agricultural spraying somewhere near you. I mean, the air you breathe can be inflammatory if you live in a very polluted area. And remember that it's not only about your physical environment, it's not always necessarily about the present time either. Some of your inflammatory factors might be psychological, past as well as present. Perhaps you missed out on vital early childhood kickstarters for your gut microbiome, like breastfeeding, natural vaginal birth, or consistent secure attachment. Perhaps your body might still be reacting to some unexamined childhood trauma. Or perhaps you're suffering under the weight of present-day stresses, such as an overwhelmingly stressful work life. All of those things can be addressed through avenues of psychological healing, which sometimes might require changes to a toxic life situation like leaving a job or an unhealthy partnership. Some of the inflammators I mentioned can be also treated with specifically targeted prebiotic or probiotic therapy. So in terms of self-care, the main takeaway is that a healthy, non-inflammatory lifestyle involves more than just diet and exercise. Our psychological needs matter just as much. Get it? To understand inflammation, we need to see that mental health and gut health can't really be spoken about separately. We need our moments of joy. We need playtime, plenty of it. We need deep connections to community, to nature. We need some access to the expressive arts or some form of self-expression. You know what? Those psychological needs are so important. There's research indicating that people who are well connected to community, who have playful lives, and who know how to find joy can be far less impacted by environmental factors that make other people sick. So connection, joy, playfulness, these are really powerful anti-inflammatories. So to take care of our health effectively, we really need to examine our history to develop a holistic profile of the main inflammatory influences in our lives, past and present. So here are a few things to say about the future of public health. The world is still picking up the pieces after the COVID pandemic. It was a devastating ordeal for entire populations. It was a civilizational trauma. But by relying on the new inflammation model of medicine, this book offers a much more complex analysis of the impact of COVID based on the most updated science of disease. So, according to the author Rupa Marya, who's a professor of medicine, the COVID virus did not kill people at random. The severe and lethal reactions were the result of an interaction between the virus and a dysregulated inflammatory response that happened for people who were already chronically inflamed. So I'm going to give you 3 quotes from this book. The first quote is, "Illness is not simply caused by a foreign entity. It is the body's response to damage that may or may not be precipitated by that entity." Now for the next quote, you'll need to remember that word exposome. We talked about it in previous videos. Exposome, which is the sum total of what our bodies have been exposed to since we were conceived. So here's the second quote. The immune system is toned by the exposome. Immune systems toned by damaging exposomes respond to an insult like COVID with overwhelming inflammation, like a string being pulled too tight. And the third and last quote, the difference between a mild course and a fatal case of COVID-19 is the presence or absence of systemic inflammation. So, you got that? In other words, it's too simplistic to say that COVID kills. COVID infects, and when the necessary inflammatory response is all messed up, that's what does the harm, with potentially fatal consequences. Now, do you remember in one of the earlier videos I'd said that the authors quoted some research showing that over 90% of people that died with COVID already had at least one, sometimes two or more, full-blown pre-existing inflammatory diseases like diabetes, hypertension, asthma, etc. The death rates tended to be concentrated in cities and in demographics that had higher toxic inflammatory overloads. So what should be our narrative about that? Do we say COVID caused the death? Or do we say COVID tipped already chronically inflamed people over the edge? The narrative is so important because it plots the course for how to protect ourselves moving forward. One of those narratives makes us want to be proactive to prepare ourselves in advance. And the other narrative leaves us waiting passively until we find out what kind of virus comes next. So the inflammation model narrative makes it super clear. It isn't enough to just focus on treating people after a virus is on the loose. In a person with chronic inflammation, the inflammatory response has gone out of control and their body is effectively attacking itself. The scary thing is, it takes a lot less of a trigger to push that person over the edge. So we have to ask the question, if the epidemic of inflammatory disease had been under control before COVID struck, how much lower might the death rate have been? So the public health response to COVID did appear to be decisive and muscular, but maybe it based itself too heavily on an older paradigm, an old scientific model of health and medicine. Now, why is it that health policy reactions didn't stack up well with the up-to-date understandings about the role of inflammation? Maybe you can put that down to a time lag between a new science and how long it can take for authorities to change policy and practice accordingly. And perhaps in the shock of an emergency, people tend to go with the devil they know. But even now, when the emergency is well and truly behind us, why do authorities still do nothing about all the inflammators in the air that we breathe, in the things we eat, in what we drink? And if you think it's too hard to get rid of the inflammators such as pollution, junk food, etc., here's something to think about. We can lock down the bulk of humanity and reorganize the very nature of work. Now think about what a colossal operation that was. It was definitely the biggest global orchestrated plan in history. So if we can impose and maintain such a ginormous logistical enterprise, then pulling a few regulatory and incentive levers here and there on big business should be, by comparison, a piece of cake. We've done it before. We shut down tobacco advertising. We stopped the production of chlorofluorocarbons that were smashing a hole in the ozone layer. And we'll never be able to count the millions of lives saved because governments dared, in those instances, to make a few rules. So I find it hard to stomach the idea that it's too hard to regulate big business in the wake of what every country in the world just had to do. In fact, what we did was to make ordinary people do the heavy lifting, while the polluters and the junk food makers continue to get off scot-free. that doesn't piss you off, I don't know what will. So I'll tell you what's hard: letting millions of people get sick and die. That shouldn't have to. That's what hard is. So not only we failed to de-inflame our environments, we added inflammation. Families and communities were separated during the most frightening time of their lives. Dysfunctional families were forcefully confined together. People went crazy. They abused each other. And there were spikes in suicide. The mental health impact of this planetary quarantine was disastrous. Though it's impossible to know exactly how many suicides were directly attributable, but for humans, a most social animal, isolation and confinement can be a form of torture. I know that for many people, extra time at home with family was absolutely welcome, and it was wonderful for them. But that did not apply to everyone. The irony is, unwanted social isolation is known to be one of the biggest inflammators, which is exactly what dysregulates our body's defenses against the virus. Another pandemic will come. They always do. And here's a statistic that absolutely floored me. Today, over 70% of all livestock around the world is factory farmed intensively. Now, factory farms are unsanitary and unecological hotbeds of disease. They are perfect incubators for new mutant viruses like bird flu, etc. So we better start regulating corporations now. If we slash air pollution, if we tax dietary salts like refined sugar and refined carbs, if we incentivize regenerative agriculture and fund better support for natural birth, for natural breastfeeding, and for healthy attachment, we can restore the human gut microbiome at population-wide levels. And that's how we prepare our immune systems to cope a lot better with the next infectious disease that comes our way. You know, when COVID came, we acted. It was like a Marshall Plan all over the world. And even if you debate the merits of this or that health policy, boy, did we mobilize. It was like a Pearl Harbor moment for the whole planet. Nothing had ever been done on that scale. Which makes it all the more strange that governments seem to be so flat-footed around a much bigger and much more preventable menace. COVID did cause over 7 million deaths around the world. It definitely warranted some kind of emergency response. That was over 3 years, by the way. But check this out. Just type 2 diabetes causes over 4 million deaths over the same time range. Diabetes is definitely an epidemic right now, and the incidence just keeps growing. But if you put together all the chronic inflammatory diseases like heart disease, stroke, cancer, respiratory diseases, etc., they account for, takes your breath away, over 40 million deaths around the world in just 1 year. So why aren't governments mobilizing some kind of emergency intervention, as we did with the COVID pandemic? What is it that keeps our eye so fixated on cures after the fact that prevention barely gets a look in? I can't help thinking that governments don't mind restraining people, but they won't say boo to corporations. Now, I know that's not always true all of the time, but to me it just feels so frustrating how often that's true. And unfortunately, this impotence of government when it comes to regulating big business has left us all as sitting ducks as we wait for the next super virus. On the positive side though, I'm very intrigued by the multifaceted benefits that preventive medicine or deep medicine implies. These initiatives offer huge bang for your buck. And here's what I mean. The same policies that would protect humanity from pollution and from degenerated soils would simultaneously restore the health of surrounding ecologies to the benefit of countless other species. And the policies that would offer better support for parents and upgrade the lives of the working poor and the disadvantaged would also restore justice and democracy and lower crime and other social dysfunctions while reducing collective inflammation, all for the price of one. So the philosophy of deep medicine, as Rupa, Marya and Patel propose, is ultimately holistic and ethical. The framework of inflammation theory provides a common thread that runs through a huge plethora of societal dilemmas, giving them all a unifying theme. And that's why I think inflammation is such a good organizing idea, organizing principle. It's such a good litmus test of the worth of a policy or an initiative. In other words, to analyze whether a proposed policy is good or not, ask, will it prevent inflammation? And if the answer is yes, then you know the policy is worthwhile and it will bear multiple downstream benefits, bigger and better than the stated aims. We don't have to be single issue activists. If we say, let's build an anti-inflammatory economy, that provides a central organizing principle that binds all of our concerns together in one cogent bundle. It's like one ring to rule them all. We need to bring inflammation into our dialogue much more often. So if you understand chronic inflammation, you realize that to oppress and to disempower a group of people is inescapably to shorten their lives. That's the ineluctable message that these authors keep coming back to. You can't be medical without being political. Freedom from chronic disease is a most quantifiable objective for social change activists. The inflammation model gives civil rights advocates a most tangible target. So there's this thing called the Gini coefficient. It's an objective, internationally accepted measure of social inequality, and the Gini coefficient shows that inequality has exploded in most countries. As a major driver of chronic inflammatory disease, inequality has proven to be a public health calamity. We need a philosophical overhaul of the current economic orthodoxy, also known as neoliberalism, that seems to have captured most nations. Neoliberalism promised a trickle-down effect. That never came, only to deliver the exact opposite. So in all our rhetoric about justice, the word inflammation should be ever present. It needs to become central to the narrative. So if I shout, "De-Inflame the world," that is possibly the most unarguably evidence-based way to strive for justice and democratic reforms. It gives activism a public health and scientific frame. Plain and simple, de-inflame the world. Now, another big question that these authors address is, it's really about who takes responsibility for de-inflaming the world. What can we achieve realistically as individuals? And what needs to be a more collective approach? You might have noticed that if there is a thematic thread that runs through every one of the 8 types of environmental causes of inflammation that I looked at in part 5, the last video, it's in one form or another all about an abuse or a misuse of power and privilege. It makes sense that the authors use the framework of colonization to explain the rise of inflammation in our communities and nations. Where there is inflammation, there tends to be a smoking gun. You could say that generally, chronic inflammation is an indicator of some kind of violation to public health, some kind of abuse of authority or commercial advantage. In any case, inflammation is chiefly a problem of human relations. That understanding is vital if we're going to generate appropriate solutions. And this is going to necessitate a fair allocation of responsibilities. Who's responsible for what? Now, these authors have exposed the dilemma that goes right to the heart of our beliefs about responsibility. Because New Age pop psychology and neoliberalism go hand in hand in many ways, surprisingly. Both have this in common. They want you to believe that each individual is fully responsible for their own destiny, and that's that. Well, that's an easy thing to say when you've lived a life of opportunity. But the idea of absolute self-responsibility comes off as pretty ridiculous when you ask, for example, what's a child's responsibility? What's a baby's responsibility? How about a person with no education surviving in a slum? Or how about, say, someone working 2 jobs just to stay afloat? What chance do they have to make major improvements in their lifestyle? Now, how can an individual be held responsible for the polluted air that they breathe, or for traumas that happened when they were children? Maybe our ideals about responsibility need a wee bit of contextualizing. Responsibility does increase incrementally as you actually gain the ability to respond. Responsibility needs to be recognized as proportional to power. More power, more responsibility. Less resources, less responsibility. But there's something else. Something else. Modern Western psychology makes the individual the superstar of his or her own life. Isn't that kind of narcissism dressed up as science? Our psychologists don't say all that much about responsibility for others, for our community, for our world. I would have thought responsibility for the world around us is the quintessential definition of being an adult. So the neoliberal position that everyone is responsible for themselves is actually kind of grandiose, narcissistic, and frankly, pretty immature. Put it this way, the philosophy of neoliberalism doesn't really sound like a grown-up talking. Now, one of the things I appreciated most about Inflamed is the stand that this book takes for our having to consider self-responsibility and social responsibilities according to our circumstances. Deep medicine means assisting people by changing their inflammatory environments when they cannot hope to do this for themselves. Now, of course, curative medicine will always be necessary when we can't do enough about the exposome that has affected us already. So thank goodness that we have medicines to tackle the symptoms of runaway inflammation, and I suspect we will still rely on those into the long term. Now, in the meantime, we have a real opportunity to sharply reduce the epidemic of chronic inflammatory disease. This is a matter of justice. It's a matter for regulatory policy. So until we hold big business to account and start meaningfully de-inflaming our world, our health budgets will be crippling, and human suffering and loss will be exorbitantly high. Here's where things get outrageous. Standing in the way of reform are the commercial interests that prevent inconvenient regulation. So the two main methods that corporate lobbies use to shut down regulation are to donate tons of money to political parties and to install a friendly revolving door of lucrative career paths between big business and government regulatory agencies so that no big favour goes unrewarded. The big money is in illness, not so much in health. The global diabetes care devices market, for example, reached $29 billion in 2024, and it's expected to almost double to $52 billion by 2029. The global diabetes drugs market is expected to reach $134 billion by 2034. Now, what's the economic cost of this preference for industrial levels of medicine? Just thinking of diabetes alone, and just in the USA in 2022, diabetes cost the American public over $410 billion in 1 year. That's in direct healthcare expenditure plus the cost of lost productivity. In Australia, in 2021, the health system expenditure for diabetes was 3.4 billion Australian dollars. Now, besides the cost in human suffering and loss, you can think of these costs as horrific, or you can also think of them as sensational business opportunities. It just depends on whether you identify with the sufferer or with the shareholder. In any case, it's super clear that preventive medicine is a huge, low-hanging fruit. But it's hard to escape the conclusion that in some key areas, public health decisions are political and commercial first, and the public good comes second. You can see why the subtitle of this book is The Anatomy of Injustice. What's killing us and making us sick is much less a matter of our genes or happenstance. It's much more a matter of abuse of power. I would say health organisations have a responsibility, as we all do, to attack the political donations system that emasculates government, that catastrophically hamstrings its ability to regulate the activities of big commercial interests in the true interest of public health. So I thank Rupa and Raj for giving us this book. I recommend it as a reference. I think it is an important manifesto for our era. I think it's a compass for healthier living at home, as well as an indispensable guidebook setting the course for policymakers and social activists. Now, if you're enjoying these videos, I'd love for you to hit the like button. Bing! Subscribe to this channel and share the video with your friends. It costs you nothing, and it makes a huge difference in helping me to keep this work rolling. Now, don't forget, I'm going to be reviewing other books for the Paradigm Shifters Book Club. So stay tuned, subscribe, and also consider subscribing to my Substack. Here's the address below. Adios.